peaceful day turned explosive when Big Shaq was attacked by a racist woman wielding a guitar. But what followed wasn't just chaos. It sparked a movement that no one could have predicted, and it shook the world to its core. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning was the kind that felt almost too perfect to be real. Clear blue skies stretched endlessly, the sun beaming warmly over Lakeside Park. Shaquille O'Neal, known to the world as Big Shaq, stood near the edge of the bustling charity event. His heart full. Families laughed, kids chased colorful balloons, and the smell of grilled food drifted through the clean open air. It was the kind of Saturday that made you believe the world could be simple again, even just for a while. Shaq adjusted his sunglasses and gave a soft wave to the volunteers bustling around the donation booths. His towering frame drew attention everywhere he went. But today wasn't about fame or flash. It was about giving back. The Big Shaq Foundation was handing out scholarships, building playgrounds, and feeding hundreds of underprivileged families, all without asking for a dime or a headline. He made his way toward the main stage, where local artists were taking turns performing. Some were good, some were barely decent, but Shaq clapped for all of them. His heart had always been too big to turn cold, no matter how much money or fame had come his way. The people mattered, their dreams mattered, and today in this little corner of America, hope was winning. He was mid-conversation with Mrs. Cartwright, a sweet 80-year-old school librarian. He'd personally helped keep her reading program alive. When it happened, a sharp, discordant twang slashed the air. Shaq turned, eyebrows pinching together in confusion. A woman stood on the side of the stage, clutching a battered acoustic guitar. She had tangled blonde hair, a scowl that could sour milk, and a body language that screamed anger in ways words never could. The woman's eyes locked on Shaq with a heat that could burn skin. She started shouting, nothing clear at first, just a raw noise of hatred cutting through the cheerful din. People started turning, murmuring. The music stuttered to a stop. Children paused mid-run. Shaq's instincts prickled. This wasn't just heckling. It was personal. You people, she shrieked, her voice ripping through the stunned quiet. You think you can just walk around like you own it all? Shaq's heart twisted, not in fear, but in deep, exhausting disappointment. He took a calming breath, raised his hands slightly in a gesture of peace. He didn't need this. Nobody needed this. Not here. Not today. Security began moving, slow and cautious, not wanting to escalate. Shaq shook his head subtly at them. He'd seen this kind of rage before. Raw, aimless, desperate. Sometimes confronting it head-on only gave it more fire. Better to let it sputter out. But the woman had other plans. With a wild screech, she swung her guitar, not throwing it, not aiming it, but hurling her hate into the world, the way some people throw punches when words fail them. The instrument didn't even reach Shaq. It shattered awkwardly on the ground a few feet from him, splintering like the brittle shell of the anger inside her. A collective gasp rushed through the crowd. Children whimpered. Parents pulled them back. A mother's hand clamped protectively around her son's arm. Phones lifted, recording. The silence afterward was thicker than any scream. Shaq didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, towering, still, heart pounding in his ears, watching the woman with eyes heavy with sadness rather than rage. How many times had he been here before? Not in this exact place, but this moment. The sharp divide between who he was and who they thought he was because of the color of his skin. The woman was grabbed by security now, protesting, spitting curses about how these people were ruining her country, her voice growing smaller as they dragged her away. Shaq watched, feeling not triumph, but an aching kind of sorrow. Racism wasn't dead. It was just louder in private and more careful in public, until it wasn't. He knelt down slowly, his huge hands gathering the broken shards of the guitar, setting them gently aside like he would gather the broken pieces of a child's toy. He didn't want anyone stepping on them. He didn't want anyone else getting hurt. Nearby, the mayor, pale, sweaty, panicked, scrambled toward him, stammering apologies. Shaq, I am so sorry. Shaq held up a hand. Not today, man, he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 exhausted Sundays. Today's about the kids. He turned back to the stage. The MC, a young guy who looked like he'd rather disappear into the ground, fumbled with his mic. Let's hear it for Big Shaq, everybody. Yeah, the event goes on, y'all. Scattered claps rang out. Awkward and unsure, Shaq knew that the moment had poisoned the atmosphere. But he smiled anyway. That big, warm smile that had melted hearts for decades. It was armor and weapon both. He stayed. He shook hands. He gave out scholarships. He posed for pictures. He danced badly with toddlers. Every photo, every handshake was an act of rebellion against the hate that had tried to claim the day. But beneath the smile, the hurt brewed. Not the sting of the woman's words. No, Shaq was long past letting words break him. It was the silence of the crowd before anyone acted. It was the way people looked down at their phones, their shoes, their hot dogs, anywhere but at injustice when it stood 3 feet away. Later, sitting on a bench near the edge of the park, Shaq let the sun sink into his skin. He closed his eyes for a second, letting the buzz of the event drift away. He thought about his mother, Lucille, and the long talks they'd had about grace and strength, about standing tall when small minds tried to drag you low. He heard a soft cough and opened one eye. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8, stood there, clutching a hand-drawn picture. In her crayon world, she had drawn Shaq as a giant with a crown, towering over a bright, smiling world. She held it out to him, shy and trembling. "For you," she whispered. "Because you're my hero." Shaq took it with hands that were way too big for such a fragile thing, and smiled the real smile, the one that reached his soul. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said, his voice a little rough. It wasn't all bad. The darkness hadn't won. Not today. Not yet. Still, as the sun dipped lower, and the laughter at the event picked up again, Shaq knew the story wasn't over. He could feel it in his bones, like the low rumble before a storm. That woman wasn't just some crazy outlier. She was a symptom of something deeper, something more dangerous. And the fact that no one had stopped her before she swung her guitar, well, that was a warning. Shaq stood up, tucking the drawing into his jacket pocket like armor. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. If the world still needed reminders that dignity couldn't be shattered like wood on concrete, he was more than willing to be that reminder. One smile, one scholarship, one defiant heartbeat at a time. As he headed back into the crowd, the sun dipped lower, turning gold against the growing twilight, and somewhere deep inside him, a new fire began to burn. He wasn't just going to survive this. He was going to make sure the world couldn't look away ever again. His publicist, Janet, called 6 times before he picked up. "Shaq," she barked. "No, hello. This is blowing up. CNN wants a comment. Good Morning America too. And TMZ is painting it as some celebrity magnet for trouble thing." He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Not right now. People are asking why you didn't fight back," she continued, urgency slicing her words thin. "Some trolls are saying you let her humiliate you. They're trying to spin it like you were weak." He chuckled bitterly. "Takes strength not to swing, Janet." She sighed heavily, the kind of sigh you only gave when you were fighting 3 wars at once. "I know that. But perception, Shaq. This isn't just a skirmish. It's turning into a narrative." He hung up gently, not because he was angry, but because he knew better than to fight the tide by yelling at the waves. He needed air. He stepped out onto his wide front porch, the wooden steps creaking under his weight. Fireflies danced in the humid dusk, oblivious to the human chaos. A few cars slowed as they passed, curious to glimpse the legend at home. A group of teenagers across the street debated loudly whether they should come ask for selfies. Shaq folded his arms and looked up at the stars, thinking about how small a man could feel even when he was built like a giant. The world had seen a woman attack him in broad daylight, at a charity event no less, and already the spin cycle had begun. Already there were commentators calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding, or questioning what he might have done to provoke it. It was the same old poison dressed up in new headlines. Inside his house, the television muttered on low volume. News anchors dissected the event like surgeons without anesthesia. He caught fragments, racially motivated. Shaquille showed remarkable restraint, but some say he should have pressed charges immediately. Calls for boycotts. Backlash brewing. He turned the TV off with a flick of his wrist. He didn't need the noise. What he needed was clarity. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about every black kid watching the footage, wondering if staying calm made you weak, if being dignified meant being walked over, if the world would ever see them as full human beings, instead of threats or headlines. He couldn't let the wrong message stick. The next morning, Shaq did something that surprised even Janet. He called a press conference. No handlers. No legal team whispering about liability. Just him standing under the wide white arches of the community center he'd built 2 years earlier. Dressed in a simple navy suit and sneakers, speaking directly to whoever cared enough to listen. "I'm not here to play the victim," he said, his voice even and powerful. "I'm not here to fan flames or sell outrage. I'm here to tell you one thing." He held up a hand, palm outward, as if pushing away the storm itself. "Hate tried to have its moment yesterday. It didn't win. It never will. Not while we keep showing up for each other." Reporters shouted questions. He took a few, answered calmly, sidestepped traps with the ease of a man who'd spent a lifetime dodging worse. No, he didn't plan to press charges yet. No. He didn't think all white people were like Amber Delaney. Yes, he forgave her, but forgiveness didn't erase consequences. And no, he wasn't done fighting for justice. He was just getting warmed up. Social media exploded again, but differently this time. Clips of his speech racked up millions of views. Parents posted videos of their kids mimicking Shaq's words in school assemblies. Celebrities, athletes, activists flooded his timeline with support. But the backlash sharpened too. Anonymous accounts flooded his pages with slurs. Conspiracy theorists accused him of staging the attack for attention. Political pundits used him as a pawn in their endless left versus right war. At the heart of it, Shaq felt something shifting, something deeper than mere outrage or sympathy. A reckoning was brewing, and whether he wanted to or not, he was smack in the middle of it. Days later, Shaq got a letter. Not an email, not a text, a real old-fashioned letter, slid under his door by someone who didn't ring the bell or knock. He unfolded the thick, creased paper and read, "You should have stayed silent. You don't belong here. Go back to where you came from before you regret it." No signature, no return address. Just the ugly, naked reminder that even giants could be hunted by cowards. He folded the letter carefully and locked it away. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Some fights were fought in open arenas with roaring crowds. Others were fought in quiet back rooms, with no witnesses but your own soul. He wasn't scared. He was focused. The attack at the park wasn't over. It had merely morphed into something bigger, uglier, and far more dangerous. And somewhere, in the twisted corridors of Amber Delaney's life, someone else was pulling strings. Shaq didn't know it yet, but the guitar wasn't the only weapon that had been aimed at him that day. And the real strike, the one that could break more than just instruments, was still on its way. In the echo that followed the guitar incident, Shaq had felt the first crack, not on his skin but somewhere deeper, somewhere invisible. The woman had been dragged away, the shattered pieces of her hatred swept aside. But what stayed, the part that lodged itself into his spirit, was the way everyone else had reacted. Or more accurately, the way they hadn't. He replayed the moment over and over in his mind in the days that followed. More vivid than any highlight reel of his playing days. The woman had screamed, had cursed, had swung. But before security even moved, before the cameras had clicked, there had been a long frozen second, where the crowd did nothing. No gasp of shock, no shouts of protest, just eyes. Eyes that widened but didn't interfere. Eyes that weighed him like he was both victim and suspect at once. Shaq had faced opposition all his life, on the court, off it. But this was different. It wasn't just personal hate. It was the permission others gave it. By standing still, by doing nothing, by pretending their silence was neutrality when it was anything but. In the days after the charity event, Shaq returned to Lakeside Park, driving through the now quieter streets alone. It was daytime again, the sun still high, but everything looked a little different. The picnic tables where families had laughed now sat deserted. The stage where music had once played now stood empty, a silent witness to a moment everyone wished would vanish. He parked and stepped out, his presence filling the open space with a gravity nobody could ignore if they had been there. He wasn't there to make a scene. He wasn't there for press. He needed to see it again, to face it, head on. A group of teenagers on skateboards paused at the far end of the park, whispering. An elderly couple feeding the ducks looked up, then looked away too quickly. A jogger crossed to the other side of the street, pretending to be engrossed in her headphones. Shaq noticed it all, not out of paranoia, but out of an instinct sharpened over decades. The instinct to know when a room, a street, a world had turned cold. He made his way to the empty stage, standing where the broken guitar had fallen days earlier. He looked down at the scuff marks still faintly visible on the wood. No one had cleaned them completely. No one wanted to talk about it. but no one wanted to erase it either. It hung in the air like unfinished business. In his heart, Shaq didn't blame the kids, or the families, or the random passers-by who had frozen that day. Fear was a powerful silencer. Fear of confrontation, fear of judgment, fear of being associated too closely with someone who might make trouble. But fear, he knew, was no excuse. The pain he carried wasn't just for himself. It was for every kid who saw that moment and learned that when you are targeted, people might look away, that when you are hurt, people might choose silence over justice. He leaned against the stage's edge, the wood warm under his palms, and let himself feel it fully for the first time. The sadness, the anger, the bitter disappointment. It would have been easier to bury it under jokes and smiles like he'd been taught to do since he was a boy. But not this time, not today. Footsteps approached, slow and uncertain. He turned to see a middle-aged man in a faded Braves cap and cargo shorts walking toward him, hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets. His face was vaguely familiar. Shaq remembered him from the event. He'd been manning the raffle table near the food trucks, the one who had frozen when the woman attacked. "Hey, Mr. O'Neill," the man said, voice cracking like old vinyl. "Mind if I say something?" Shaq nodded, the weight of the moment settling between them, like humidity. I was there," the man said, shifting from foot to foot. "I saw what happened." He broke off, rubbing the back of his neck. "I should have done something. I should have stepped in. But I didn't." Shaq stayed silent, letting the man fill the empty space with truth. "I guess I was scared," the man admitted, voice dropping. "Not of her, of making it worse, of being seen standing next to you and someone thinking, I don't know, that I was picking sides." Shaq raised an eyebrow, a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible. "I didn't think I was racist," the man said quickly, desperate. "I mean, I voted for hell, that doesn't matter, I didn't help you. And I'm sorry." Shaq studied him, not with anger, not with pity, but with a deep, weighing kind of understanding that went past words. "You froze," Shaq said simply. "That's what happened." The man nodded, shame written across his posture. "Freezing is human," Shaq continued. "But it's what you do after that matters." The man blinked. Shaq didn't offer forgiveness like a priest handing out absolution. He offered truth. And it was heavier. But it was real. "I hope next time," Shaq said, pushing away from the stage, "you move." He didn't wait for a response. He left the man standing there, grappling with the kind of accountability no apology could shortcut. As Shaq walked back to his truck, a news van pulled up near the park entrance. The reporter, a slim woman with sharp features and sharper ambitions, jumped out, microphone in hand. "Shaq, quick word, people are dying to know. Do you think the crowd's silence made them complicit?" He paused, letting the question hang like an accusation in the humid air. He thought about giving the easy answer. Thought about saying something polished, media-friendly, but easy wasn't enough anymore. "I think," he said carefully, "that silence isn't neutral. It's a choice." The reporter opened her mouth to push for more, but Shaq was already walking away, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the heavy summer air. That night, his words went viral. Some praised him for his grace. Others mocked him, twisting his message into headlines about celebrity victimhood and race baiting. But Shaq didn't care about the noise. He cared about the silence. He cared about the kid watching at home, seeing that even giants could be struck down by hate, and seeing that even when they were, they could rise without swinging back. In the following days, he noticed the shifts in subtle ways. Clerks at the grocery store smiled a little more carefully. Neighbors waved with awkward, guilty energy. Invitations to high-profile galas quietly evaporated. Brands he'd worked with for years issued lukewarm "we stand against hate" statements, but made no move to reach out privately. It was the quiet retaliation of those who didn't want to be forced to pick a side. Shaq understood. He really did, but he also knew that neutrality, in the face of hate, was itself a weapon. He decided, sitting in his living room late one night, staring at the silent, glowing city skyline, that he would not allow the story to end here, that he would not let silence be the final word. There was more at stake than his reputation. There was the soul of the community he loved, the future of kids who looked like him, the unseen weight that Black Americans carried daily, weights made heavier, not just by acts of hate, but by the silence of those who claimed to be allies, yet failed when it mattered most. He wasn't just going to wait for the next attack. He was going to push first. Push conversations. Push change. Push past the uncomfortable silences until they cracked wide open. Shaq set his jaw, a determination settling into his bones. The real fight wasn't against guitars or slurs or viral clips. It was against the silent nods, the averted eyes, the good people doing nothing, while evil wrote the louder story. And Shaq? He was about to change the script. Shaq had always been good at smiling through pain. It was a skill learned young, honed sharp by years of being the biggest kid in the room, the most visible target for cruelty. No one dared speak aloud. After the park incident, after the tidal wave of attention and tension, he did what he had been taught to do. He smiled. Television appearances, radio call-ins, impromptu interviews on the sidewalk. He handled them all with that easy charm the public adored. He laughed at the right moments, shrugged off pointed questions with jokes, kept the conversations light, safe, palatable. But beneath that practiced exterior, the old bruise throbbed. It wasn't just about the woman who had attacked him, or the silence that followed. It was about the echo, the way the present rang with the voices of the past. Voices he had buried so deep he sometimes forgot they existed, until moments like this tore the surface apart. He found himself one evening, long after the cameras had turned away, sitting in the back corner of his home gym, the lights off, the vast space shadowed and silent. He sat on the edge of the boxing ring he rarely used, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. The smell of rubber mats and iron weights filled the air, grounding him. But his mind wasn't here. It was decades back, in a different room, a different place. He was 10 years old again, standing outside his elementary school's gymnasium, clutching a crumpled permission slip in one massive hand. It had been field day, and he had been so excited to run the races, to show everyone how fast he was, how strong. He had worn his favorite sneakers, double-knotted just the way his mom had taught him. But when it came time to pick teams, the teacher, Mrs. Henderson, a thin woman with a pinched mouth and a too-tight bun, had smiled thinly and steered him to the sidelines. "We need to make it fair, Shaquille," she had said, loud enough for the other kids to hear. "You're too big. It wouldn't be fair to the others." The words had stung worse than any playground insult. Too big. Too much. Not fair. He hadn't understood it then. Not fully. But he had felt the weight of it. The way eyes shifted when he moved. The way adults talked about fairness, only when it came to making sure he didn't outshine the others. The way blackness and bigness and boldness were seen not as gifts but as threats needing to be managed, contained, silenced. That bruise had never fully healed. It had just gone underground, covered by years of trophies and applause and endorsements, hidden behind a fortress of charisma. Until now, the guitar attack had ripped the scab right off. He thought about his mother, Lucille, and the nights she would sit him down at the kitchen table, serious and steady, teaching him how to survive in a world that would sometimes hate him just for existing. "Baby," she would say, her voice a low melody of strength, "the world's gonna see you before they hear you. And when they see you, some of them are gonna be scared, not because you did anything wrong, but because you're big, and you're black, and you're brilliant, and fear makes people ugly." He remembered nodding solemnly, too young to grasp the depth of it, but old enough to feel its truth humming under his skin. Now, sitting alone in the dark, he understood fully. It wasn't just about what had happened at the park. It was about a lifetime of being told subtly, bluntly, brutally, that he needed to shrink himself to fit other people's comfort zones. Shaq leaned back against the ring ropes, feeling their slight give under his weight, and let out a long breath. He couldn't afford to be angry, not in the way people expected. Anger would be the headline they wanted. Shaq loses it. Shaq rants. Shaq threatens. They were waiting for it, salivating for it, because anger would make it easier to dismiss him, to fold him into the tired stereotypes they already had filed away. So he chose grace. Not because it was easy, because it was necessary. He picked himself up off the mat, both physically and mentally, and moved through the days with deliberate purpose. He showed up to meetings. He answered calls. He strategized with his foundation team about next steps. He filmed PSAs about kindness, about standing up for what's right. He kept the smile ready, the jokes handy, but inside the bruise throbbed. One afternoon, about a week after the incident, he found himself visiting his old elementary school, not as a guest speaker, not for a photo op, just because. The place had changed in some ways. New paint, new playground equipment, but in others it felt frozen in amber. He walked the halls slowly, trailing his fingers along the cool cinderblock walls, letting the memories wash over him. The current principal, Mrs. Kendall, greeted him warmly, offering a private tour. She was kind, enthusiastic, clearly honored to have him there. She led him to the gymnasium, the same one where he'd first learned that being great could make you a target. It was smaller than he remembered. Funny how that worked. As a kid, it had seemed cavernous. Now it barely contained him. He stood in the center of the basketball court, looking up at the faded championship banners, and thought about all the kids who had come through here since him. How many had carried the same invisible bruises? How many had learned early and painfully that no matter how kind or talented or hard-working they were, there would always be someone trying to shrink them? He felt Mrs. Kendall watching him, waiting for him to say something profound. He just smiled, that old reliable shield, and said, "Place looks good." Later, as he sat in his truck outside the school, he pulled out his phone and opened his notes app. He typed one sentence: "Greatness isn't the problem, fear is." He didn't know yet what he would do with those words. A speech? A book? A campaign? Maybe all of it. Maybe none. What he knew was that the hidden bruises, the ones the world refused to see, were real, and if he didn't name them, if he didn't give them voice, they would fester. Not just in him, in every kid who saw themselves in him. He refused to let that happen. Not on his watch. He thought about the little girl with the crayon drawing, about the apology from the raffle man, about the cowardly letter slid under his door. 3 different responses to the same event. Hope, regret, hate. The world was a messy, tangled place. But somewhere in that mess, he had a purpose bigger than basketball, bigger than fame. He wasn't just a former athlete, a celebrity, a brand. He was a symbol. And symbols didn't get the luxury of hiding bruises. Symbols had to stand, bruised, battered, smiling if they could, grimacing if they had to, but standing all the same. Shaq tapped the steering wheel lightly, feeling the rhythm of his heartbeat in the quiet. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The bruise was still there, pulsing under the surface. But it wasn't a weakness. It was a reminder of where he came from, of who he was, and of what he still had to do. As he pulled out of the parking lot, merging into the steady hum of afternoon traffic, Shaq felt a new determination settling into him like armor. The world had seen the smile. Soon, they would see the strength beneath it. The cameras had arrived faster than the ambulances ever could have. That was the first truth Shaq learned in the aftermath. Before the woman who attacked him even finished shouting, the red lights of news vans had started flickering at the edge of the park. Microphones multiplied like weeds. Reporters elbowing each other for a better shot, eager not to miss the next big outrage story. At first it seemed like the tide was on his side. Clips circulated, showing the woman's screaming face twisted in fury, the crack of her guitar against the concrete, the stunned stillness of the crowd. There was outrage, there were hashtags, there were carefully worded posts from celebrities offering their support and love. For a moment it felt like the truth was simple and clear, an unprovoked racist attack against a beloved figure of American culture. But the media didn't thrive on simple truths. Simple didn't get ratings. Simple didn't spark debate. So it wasn't long before the headlines started bending, twisting into ugly shapes. Shaq recognized all too well. The first chink in the armor came from a local news station, desperate for a unique angle. They ran an interview with Amber Delaney's former neighbor, a woman who described her as troubled but creative, a passionate artist misunderstood by a society that doesn't value free expression. Shaq watched the segment play out on his living room television, the slick anchor nodding solemnly, as the neighbor painted Amber as a tragic figure, a victim of economic hardship, mental health struggles, artistic frustration. The narrative shifted subtly, but powerfully. The racist wasn't the villain anymore. She was a wounded bird, lashing out in pain. Next came the think pieces. An opinion columnist from a national newspaper penned a viral essay titled, "When Public Figures Intimidate Without Meaning to." The premise was as absurd as it was dangerous, that Shaq's very size, presence and fame might have triggered Amber's fear response. That perhaps, subconsciously, she had felt cornered, endangered even, by a man who had done nothing but exist in her line of sight. Shaq read the article twice, disbelief simmering into something dangerously close to rage. He hadn't spoken to her, hadn't approached her, hadn't so much as looked at her, until she had attacked him. And yet somehow in the twisted court of public opinion, his blackness, his bigness, his very being was becoming a justification for her hate. He tossed the paper aside, the pages fluttering to the floor like wounded birds. It didn't stop there. Cable news panels sprang up like weeds after rain. Panels of experts, none of whom had been there, debated endlessly whether Shaq had provoked the attack by simply being Shaq. Was his presence political by nature? Should celebrities expect public outbursts? Was it fair to paint Amber as purely malicious without understanding her background? Shaq sat through a segment where a conservative host sneered, "Maybe these celebrities need to realize they aren't always the good guys," while the liberal guest wrung her hands and said, "We must have empathy for mental illness, even when it manifests in unfortunate ways." Unfortunate ways. Shaq turned off the TV, staring at his own reflection in the blank black screen. How easily the story had been stolen. How quickly sympathy for blatant racism had been manufactured, spun out like candy floss for mass consumption. He wasn't surprised. But it still hurt. The next day, photographers camped outside his house. Some shouted questions. "Shaq, do you forgive her? Shaq, are you dropping charges? Shaq, do you think you scared her?" Others just snapped photos, each flash capturing him mid-blink, mid-step, mid-breath, moments they would later manipulate into whatever narrative they needed. Even his endorsement deals felt the ripple. 2 major brands called private meetings, speaking in the smooth, cautious language of corporate America. They wanted assurances that Shaq wouldn't escalate things, that he would stay positive, that he would remember he represented all demographics. He had laughed, a short, bitter bark of sound that startled the executives on the call. Represent all demographics? He couldn't even walk in a public park without someone seeing him as a threat. Still, he agreed. Because he knew the stakes. Not just for himself, but for every young black boy watching, learning what the world expected of them. Smile. Be gracious. Be bigger than the hate. Even when the hate was bigger than any one man could carry. Shaq kept his public appearances light, his social media posts positive. He leaned on humor when he could, wisdom when he couldn't. But in private with the few people he trusted, the frustration boiled over. In a quiet conversation with his old college friend Terrence, he let the mask slip. "They're trying to rewrite it, he said, pacing the length of his study. "Turn me into the problem." Terrence nodded grimly. "They always do, bro. You're too big, too black, too loud, even when you ain't saying a word." Shaq stopped pacing, staring out the window at the vultures in their vans. "They want me to vanish," he said, "or they want me to explode. Either way, they win." "So what were you gonna do?" Terrence asked. Shaq turned, a slow, heavy movement full of purpose. "I'm gonna tell the truth," he said. Louder than they can spin it. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. A major network offered him an exclusive interview. Live, prime time, no commercial breaks. The kind of platform few were ever given. The producer promised total control. "Your story, your words," she said. "We won't twist anything." Shaq knew better than to trust promises. But he also knew better than to waste platforms. He agreed. The night of the interview, the world tuned in. Millions of Americans sat in their living rooms, waiting to see if Big Shaq would cry, or rage, or crumble under the weight of it all. Instead, he sat calmly, wearing a simple black shirt, no jewelry, no flash, just a man too big for the chair they gave him, looking square into the camera. "I didn't ask for this moment," he began, voice steady. "But I'm here now, so let's talk about it." He spoke about the park, about the attack, about the long history of being feared for his body before he was ever known for his mind. He spoke about silence, the silence of crowds, of brands, of politicians. He spoke about forgiveness, not as an excuse for injustice, but as a refusal to be poisoned by it. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He simply told the truth, layered and complex, and raw. And in doing so, he made it impossible to twist. For a while it worked. The ratings soared. Viewers cried. Opinion pieces shifted slightly back toward sympathy. Even the cynical late-night hosts offered soft praise. But Shaq wasn't naive. He knew the media cycle, knew that today's hero was tomorrow's target, knew that for every person moved by his words, there were others looking for the next misstep, the next soundbite to weaponize. He couldn't control the circus. He could only control himself. In the days that followed, Amber Delaney's lawyer mounted her defense. She was portrayed as mentally unstable, struggling with trauma, incapable of understanding the consequences of her actions. The media lapped it up, painting her as another casualty of a broken system, rather than the architect of her own hate. Shaq didn't comment publicly. He didn't need to, because real truth didn't scream. It endured. He doubled down on his community work, visiting schools, holding town halls, funding scholarships. Not for cameras, not for applause, but because action spoke louder than spin. And slowly, painfully, the narrative shifted again. Not because the media willed it, because the people demanded it. Parents brought their kids to meet him, not to ask for autographs, but to say thank you. Teachers invited him to speak about resilience. Coaches asked him to mentor teams about strength that wasn't physical but moral. The invisible truth, the one the cameras couldn't distort, was that dignity once planted grew roots too deep to yank out. Shaq had been bruised, mocked, twisted, but he had not been broken. And in a world addicted to tearing down giants, that endurance was a revolution all its own. As he walked into another elementary school gym one crisp Friday morning, greeted by the squeal of excited kids who didn't care about headlines, only about hope, Shaq smiled, not the forced public smile, but the real one. The one Lucille had taught him when he was small. He was still standing, still smiling, still telling the truth, no matter who tried to twist it. And the circus, noisy and desperate, spun uselessly around him, unable to touch the quiet, immovable strength at his core. Some things shouldn't stay hidden, Calvin said simply. Shaq tucked the drive away, heart pounding with a new kind of urgency. The second ally came that same afternoon, in the unlikeliest of places, a crumbling library on the west side of town. Shaq had come to donate books, a small gesture to a place that had once been his sanctuary, as a boy. He wasn't planning on staying long. A few photos, a quick handshake, a promise of more support. But as he wandered the aisles lost in the smell of paper and dust, a voice called out, "You know, they did the same thing in my day." Shaq turned to see a wiry old woman perched behind the checkout desk, eyes sharp behind wire-framed glasses. Her nameplate read Mrs. Eloise Grant. "They twisted our stories too," she continued, not bothering with pleasantries, "made the Freedom Riders look like thugs, painted Martin as a troublemaker. Always easier to vilify the ones who won't bow their heads." Shaq approached, drawn by something in her tone, an unflinching clarity. "You know who you are," Mrs. Grant said, tapping a bony finger against the counter. "But knowing isn't enough. You gotta make them know it too. Make it impossible for them to pretend otherwise." She leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper that still felt like a roar. "I kept records, newspaper clippings, photos, eyewitness accounts, stuff nobody wanted to keep alive. They said it was history. I say it's a blueprint." Shaq blinked, stunned. "You have all that?" he asked. Mrs. Grant smiled, a sly, knowing grin. "I've got proof, young man. Proof that this country has a memory like a sieve. And if you want to remind them, you're gonna need every scrap of it." She slid a thick envelope across the counter, so casually it might have been a library card. Shaq picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of decades of unseen battles within. "Don't let them bury you," she said softly. "Or the truth." Two unexpected allies. Two pieces of ammunition. But the third came when he least expected it. Shaq had just returned home, exhaustion dragging at his bones, when he found a note tucked under his front door. It was scribbled hastily, almost illegibly. "Meet me at Riverview Diner. Midnight. Come alone." Normally he would have ignored it. Too risky. Too strange. But something about it, maybe the day's earlier events, maybe instinct, made him slip on a hoodie and head out into the heavy night. The diner sat on the edge of town, neon flickering weakly against the dark. Inside it was almost empty except for a hulking figure sitting at the corner booth, back to the wall, coffee steaming in front of him. Shaq recognized him instantly. Walt "Grizz" Green, a former Marine, a legend in the community. Known for his iron will and gruff demeanor, Grizz had served 3 tours overseas, then returned to find a country still waging quieter wars at home. Shaq slid into the booth opposite him. "Thought you might come," Grizz rumbled, not looking up from his coffee. "You leave the note?" Shaq asked. Grizz nodded. "Been watching." "Why?" Grizz finally met his eyes. Hard eyes. Clear eyes. "Because I know what it's like to be set up to fail. To have the world judge you before you even open your mouth. And because I don't plan on sitting by while they do it to you." Shaq waited, sensing more. Grizz slid a battered manila folder across the table. "Contacts," he said gruffly. "Reporters, editors, whistleblowers. People who still care about real truth. Off-the-record folks, ones the big networks don't control yet." Shaq flipped the folder open, scanning names, phone numbers, encrypted emails. "This is dangerous," he said. Grizz smiled grimly. "Truth always is." For a long moment, neither man spoke, the silence thick with understanding. "You don't have to do this," Shaq said finally. Grizz shrugged. "Ain't about have to. It's about must." Outside, the neon light buzzed faintly against the windows. A soft, stubborn glow. Shaq tucked the folder under his arm as he stood. "Thank you," he said simply. Grizz just grunted, as if to say go get him. As Shaq drove home that night, the city lights stretched around him like a constellation of possibilities. He was no longer standing alone. Behind him, in the shadows where the cameras couldn't reach, allies were gathering. Not polished spokespeople, not corporate backers, but real people. Brave people. People who understood that sometimes the most powerful stand wasn't made in the spotlight, but in the quiet, stubborn spaces where truth refused to die. And together they were going to do more than defend the truth. They were going to drag it into the light, kicking and screaming if necessary. Because this wasn't just Shaq's fight anymore. It was all of theirs. And the world wasn't ready for what was coming. The summons arrived not by mail, but hand-delivered by a courier in a sharp black suit and expressionless sunglasses. He said little, only confirming Shaq's identity before sliding the heavy envelope into his hands and vanishing down the driveway like a ghost. Shaq stood there under the burning afternoon sun, envelope heavy in his palm, already knowing without opening it that the real war had finally begun. Inside, the legal papers were crisp, clinical, cold. Amber Delaney versus Shaquille O'Neal. Defamation. Harassment. Emotional distress. The irony of the charges nearly made him laugh, but the knot tightening in his chest left no room for humor. This wasn't about justice. It was about silencing him. Shaq sat at the kitchen table, the old wood scarred from years of use, staring at the papers while his lawyer, Melvin Carter, an old-school fighter with more battle scars than suits, paced the floor. "They're flipping the whole thing," Melvin said, voice tight with disgust. "They're gonna say you destroyed her life. Say you weaponized your fame against a private citizen. Paint her as the victim of a merciless public machine." Shaq leaned back, hands folded across his chest. "I didn't say a damn thing about her after it happened." "Doesn't matter," Melvin snapped. "You breathed, and it made headlines. That's enough." Outside, a lawnmower buzzed, the mundane sound of a world still turning while his tilted on the brink of disaster. Melvin dropped a thick manila folder onto the table. "They're offering a settlement." Shaq arched an eyebrow. "Already?" Melvin nodded grimly. $2 million. Confidential. No admission of guilt. But you have to sign a gag order. No more public statements. No interviews. No speeches. They want you to vanish quietly." Shaq stared at the folder as if it might burst into flames. "They're scared," he said finally. "They're terrified," Melvin confirmed. "Terrified you'll drag this into open court. Terrified of what else might come out." Shaq tapped a finger against the folder, thinking. He knew how these things worked. Settlements were the currency of silence. Money to buy the illusion that nothing had really happened, that no one needed to change, that the system was fine, pristine, unbroken. But it wasn't about money for him. It never had been. It was about the truth. And the truth didn't settle quietly. Still, the risk clawed at him. Taking it to court meant dragging his name through the mud. It meant hours of brutal cross-examinations, media smears, twisted headlines. It meant exposing not just himself but every vulnerable kid who looked up to him, every community project tied to his name. It meant Amber's lawyers would paint him as a bully, an aggressor, a threat. And worst of all, it meant giving the world another excuse to stop listening. Melvin must have read the storm in his eyes, because he leaned across the table, voice low. "You could lose," he said, not unkindly. "This isn't a fair fight. It's a setup." Shaq looked at the settlement offer again, felt the blood pounding in his ears. "If I take it," he said slowly, "what happens to her?" "Nothing," Melvin said flatly. "She fades away. Headlines die. She gets her life back. You move on. Everyone forgets." Shaq's jaw tightened.
That was the problem.
Forgetting. He thought about Calvin, with his shaky footage of frozen faces. About Mrs. Grant, and her envelope of buried history. About Grizz, and his folder of underground contacts. About the kids who watched with wide, uncertain eyes, wondering if telling the truth was worth the price. He thought about the bruises under his own skin, still aching from battles fought decades ago. And he made his decision. "We're going to court," he said. Melvin's mouth tightened, but he nodded once, a soldier acknowledging the battle ahead. "Then buckle up," he said. "They're gonna come for everything." The days leading up to the first hearing felt like standing on a fault line, the tremors constant, the ground never quite stable. The media dug deeper. Stories leaked. Anonymous sources claimed Shaq had intimidated Amber with his stature and presence. Tabloids dredged up unrelated photos of Shaq looking stern or frustrated, framing him as angry, volatile. Talk shows debated the dangers of celebrity influence and mob justice. Pundits argued about free speech, mental health, race, power twisting the narrative, until even clear-cut facts became muddy, distorted reflections in a funhouse mirror. Shaq kept his head down, focusing on the people who mattered. Calvin provided his footage, the raw, unedited truth showing Amber's hatred, and the crowd's chilling paralysis. Mrs. Grant supplied old news clippings, eerily similar stories from decades past, where victims had been vilified and aggressors sanitized. Grizz connected him with independent journalists, ones willing to tell the unfiltered story without corporate strings pulling the narrative. Piece by piece, they built a defense not of technicalities or loopholes, but of humanity, of history, of truth. When the day finally came, Shaq walked into the courthouse wearing a simple gray suit and an expression carved from stone. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. Protesters lined the sidewalks, some holding signs of support, others dripping with hate, thinly veiled as concern. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Amber sat at the plaintiff's table, a carefully curated picture of fragility. Soft sweater, loose hair, no makeup. Her lawyers spoke for her, painting her as a damaged artist crushed by the unrelenting machine of public opinion. Shaq sat silent as their words twisted the knife. They accused him of encouraging harassment, of weaponizing his platform, of endangering Amber's life. Not once did they mention her attack. Not once did they acknowledge the slurs, the violence, the hatred she had unleashed. When it was their turn, Melvin rose slowly, like a man lifting a sword from sacred ground. He didn't yell. He didn't rant. He simply laid the truth bare. The footage Calvin had captured played on the screen, filling the courtroom with the sound of Amber's screaming, the thud of the shattered guitar, the stunned silence of the crowd. Gasps echoed through the room. Melvin followed with Mrs. Grant's evidence, linking Amber's narrative to a long, shameful history of victim blaming and erasure. He ended with Shaq's interview clips, his calm dignity, his refusal to stoop. When Shaq finally took the stand, he didn't deliver a prepared speech. He spoke from the heart. "I didn't ask for this," he said, voice steady. "But when hate shows itself, you don't fight it by hiding. You fight it by standing tall. Even when you're tired, even when they want you to sit down." He looked directly at the jury, his voice a deep, resonant anchor. "I forgave her. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and silence isn't peace. It's surrender. And I don't plan to surrender." When he stepped down, the courtroom sat frozen for a long, trembling beat. The judge recessed for deliberations. Hours dragged into a day. The media camped outside the courthouse, each hour feeding 1,000 more headlines. Shaq waited, his future dangling on the edge of a knife. Finally, the jury returned. The verdict was read. Shaq won, not just legally, but morally. Vindicated, seen, heard. The judge awarded him $1 in damages, a symbolic victory, a statement that this had never been about money. It had been about the truth. The media, desperate for another spin, tried to refocus. They called the verdict unexpected, controversial, a troubling precedent. But the people saw clearer. Shaq didn't throw a party, didn't celebrate. He visited a community center instead, kneeling to speak with a group of wide-eyed kids. They didn't care about courtrooms or settlement. They cared about the story. And Shaq, smiling that deep, real smile, knew the story was what mattered. He hadn't settled. He hadn't backed down. And in doing so, he had cracked the system, even if just a little, even if just for a moment. Sometimes a crack was all it took for the light to get in. Victory, Shaq realized quickly, was a fragile thing. It tasted sweet for a fleeting moment, a sharp, exhilarating high, and then reality came crashing back down harder than before. Winning the trial didn't close the chapter. It only exposed how deep the rot really went. The first sign came in the form of a letter. No stamp, no return address, just slid under his front door like a threat whispered in the dark. The envelope was plain, almost insultingly so, the kind you might buy by the hundred at an office supply store. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in a cold bureaucratic font. You should have taken the deal. Some things are bigger than you. Stay quiet or we'll make you. Shaq read it once, then again. His gut tightened, not with fear. He knew how to handle threats, but with something heavier, confirmation. This wasn't just about Amber Delaney. This wasn't about one woman's hatred boiling over in a park. This was systemic, organized, bigger. The second sign came 3 days later, when a scheduled appearance at a youth center was abruptly canceled. No warning, no call. When Shaq showed up anyway, he found the place dark and shuttered. A hand-scrawled sign taped to the door, closed for maintenance. But there was no maintenance crew, no trucks, no work permits. Just silence. When he called the center's director, a woman who had previously begged for his support, she answered on the second ring, her voice tight and brittle. "I'm sorry, Shaq. We can't have you here anymore." "Why not?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "There's pressure," she said, words tripping over themselves. "From the board, from the donors. They say you're too controversial now." Shaq thanked her politely, hung up and stared at the empty building. Controversial. That's what they called it when you told the truth too loudly. The third and most painful blow came from someone he had trusted. Jarrett Lane had been a friend since college. Not just a friend, a brother. They'd played pickup games in the sweltering Georgia sun, pulled each other through bad breakups and worse business deals. Jarrett had been there through it all. Loyal, solid. Or so Shaq thought. He found out differently when a tabloid broke the story. Exclusive leaked emails. Private conversations. Jarrett offering information. Personal vulnerable moments from Shaq's life, to the highest bidder, painting him as unstable, vengeful, untrustworthy, feeding the growing machine, eager to tear him down. Shaq read the article in stunned silence. Each paragraph a knife between the ribs. He tried to tell himself it wasn't true, that Jarrett had been hacked, tricked, framed, but the evidence was too clear, too deliberate. Betrayal, he realized, didn't need a grand betrayal scene. Sometimes it just arrived in your inbox. Ugly and undeniable. He didn't call Jarrett, didn't confront him. Some endings didn't deserve the dignity of closure. Instead, Shaq gathered his team, Melvin, Calvin, Mrs. Grant, Grizz, the people who had proven they were in this fight not for fame or profit, but because it was right. Sitting around the long oak table in his study, he laid it all out. The threats, the cancellations, the betrayal. "They're trying to isolate you," Melvin said grimly, tapping a pen against his notebook. "Classic strategy. Cut off your support, make you look like you're standing alone, then crush you." "But who's they?" Calvin asked, frustration crackling in his voice. "It can't just be a bunch of angry racists. This is organized." Mrs. Grant leaned forward, eyes sharp as flint. "It's the ones who profit from silence," she said. "From fear, from keeping folks in their place. It's been that way since long before any of us were born." Shaq nodded slowly. He wasn't naive. Racism wasn't just the loud bigot in the street. It was the boardroom full of executives who smiled in your face and pulled strings behind your back. It was the donors who funded community programs, but demanded you stay apolitical. It was the networks who cheered your charity work but fell silent when you spoke uncomfortable truths. It was a network, sprawling and insidious, hiding in plain sight. And now it had turned its sights on him. Grizz pulled out a battered manila folder, his calling card at this point, and slid it across the table. "I've been digging," he said. "Found something you need to see." Inside were documents. Donation records. Tax filings. Private emails hacked and leaked by unknown sources. A web of connections between Amber Delaney's lawyer, a prominent local judge, a handful of city council members, and most disturbingly, major donors to several youth organizations Shaq had supported. The message was clear: step out of line, and they would pull the rug out from under every community he cared about. "They're scared of what you represent," Mrs. Grant said quietly. "Not just a big black man who won't bow. A movement, an idea, a crack in their control." Shaq leaned back, heart pounding not with fear but with clarity. This wasn't a fight he could win with a viral speech or a tearful interview. This was war. Silent, strategic, ruthless, and he was all in. The first move came through back channels. A concerned intermediary requested a private meeting. Shaq agreed, curious more than anything else. They met at a coffee shop in Midtown, neutral ground buzzing with oblivious civilians. The intermediary was slick, corporate, unremarkable, the kind of man who could disappear into any crowd. He ordered a black coffee, no cream, no sugar, and got straight to the point. "You're upsetting some very powerful people," he said, voice low, but steady. "People who prefer stability." Shaq arched an eyebrow. "Stability for who?" The man smiled thinly. "For everyone. For the economy. For the community. And what do these powerful people want from me?" "Simple," the man said. "Tone it down, stop fanning the flames. Focus on positive charity work. Leave the past in the past." Shaq sipped his water, never breaking eye contact. "And if I don't?" The man's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll find doors closing, opportunities vanishing, partners reconsidering." He slid a small, sleek envelope across the table. Inside, Shaq found a check with more zeros than he'd ever seen outside of NBA contracts. "Consider it an incentive," the man said. "A show of goodwill." Shaq folded the envelope once, twice, slowly and deliberately. Then he tucked it back into the man's coat pocket. "Tell your people," he said, voice like iron, "I'm not for sale." The man's smile didn't falter. It merely cooled. "Shame," he said. "We could have done great things together." Shaq stood up, towering over him. "I am doing great things," he said. And he walked out. The whispers grew louder after that. Anonymous threats escalated. Partnerships collapsed without warning. Friends distanced themselves, citing scheduling conflicts and branding concerns. But Shaq didn't bend. Instead, he dug deeper. He funded independent journalism, exposing the hidden network manipulating local politics. He sponsored scholarships for whistleblowers, kids willing to speak uncomfortable truths. He used his platform not to plead for acceptance but to demand accountability. And slowly, painfully, cracks appeared. Some community leaders found their spines. Some media outlets found their courage. Some donors realized public backlash was more dangerous than progress. It wasn't a revolution. Not yet. But it was a start. And Shaq knew better than anyone. Change didn't come from standing in the spotlight. It came from standing in the shadows and refusing to be moved. The invitation was carefully worded, carefully timed. A televised community event, broadcast live across the country. A celebration of unity and progress, featuring leaders, athletes, musicians. Shaq's name was near the top of the list, framed as a special guest of honor. He knew what they were trying to do. Reabsorb him, rebrand him. Smooth over the jagged truths he had exposed by slotting him into a safe, polished showcase. Let him wave, smile, pose for pictures. Let him be their symbol of harmony, while the real problems went unspoken, untouched. But Shaq had different plans. The venue was massive, an outdoor stadium draped in banners of diversity. Slogans about togetherness and hope. Media trucks crowded the perimeter, their satellite dishes stabbing at the sky. Vendors hawked hot dogs and bottled water. Volunteers wore matching t-shirts emblazoned with the event's corporate sponsors. Shaq arrived without fanfare, stepping from his SUV into the backstage chaos of handlers and stage managers barking into headsets. His presence sucked the air from the space. Heads turned, murmured whispers floated in his wake. Some in awe, some in suspicion. He was handed a schedule, a speech outline, a polite request to keep his remarks positive and inspiring. Shaq nodded, smiled that heavy, patient smile he had perfected over a lifetime of being underestimated. Then he threw the script away. Out in the crowd, tens of thousands gathered. Some genuinely eager, some skeptical, many just curious, waiting to see if Big Shaq would be the gentle giant they remembered, or the problem the headlines had warned them about. Backstage, Calvin hovered nervously by the equipment crates, the flash drive clutched in his hand. "You sure about this?" he whispered. Shaq glanced at him, a mountain of calm. "If we don't tell it straight," he said, "they'll bury it crooked." Mrs. Grant stood nearby, regal in a sharp blue dress, clutching her satchel of old records like a shield. Grizz leaned against a pillar, arms crossed, eyes scanning the exits. Melvin reviewed last-minute legal contingencies, muttering curses under his breath. Shaq walked to the curtain, waiting for his cue. The MC, a grinning television personality, was wrapping up a saccharine monologue about overcoming obstacles and finding common ground. The applause swelled. The cameras panned the smiling faces in the audience. And now, the MC boomed. "A man who needs no introduction, a symbol of strength, compassion and unity. Shaquille O'Neal. Thunderous applause erupted. Shaq stepped onto the stage, every step deliberate, every breath measured. He stood at the podium, towering above the assembled crowd, the lights blazing down on him. For a moment he let the cheers wash over him, not to bask, but to remind himself the world was watching. When the noise finally faded, he leaned into the microphone. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "I'm grateful to be here. Grateful to see so many faces. Grateful for the chance to speak." He paused, scanning the sea of expectant faces. "And I'm gonna speak the truth." There was a ripple through the crowd, a subtle shift in posture, a collective tightening. "I was asked to come here today to celebrate," Shaq continued. "To smile, to inspire, to pretend like everything is fine." He let the words hang. "But everything isn't fine." A beat of stunned silence. Shaq reached into his jacket and pulled out the flash drive. He held it up between two fingers, letting the cameras zoom in. "This," he said, "is the footage they didn't want you to see." He turned toward the giant video screens behind him, nodding once to Calvin, who was stationed at the tech table. The screens flickered, then lit up. Raw, unedited footage filled the stadium. Amber Delaney screaming, the guitar smashing, the slurs unmistakable. The crowd, frozen, faces twisted in discomfort, in fear, in complicity. Gasps echoed through the stands. Shaq let it play. He didn't shield them. He didn't soften it. When the video ended, he turned back to the mic. "You saw it," he said. "Not the edited sound bites. Not the twisted headlines. The truth." Another beat of silence. Heavy, uncomfortable. "Some people," he continued, "wanted me to let it go. Wanted me to smile and move on. Take the money. Stay quiet. Pretend it didn't happen." He shook his head slowly. "But silence isn't healing. It's hiding. And I'm done hiding." He stepped away from the podium, pacing slowly across the stage, commanding the space like an old warrior surveying a battlefield. "You see, the real danger isn't in the ones who scream their hate loud enough for cameras to catch. It's in the ones who whisper behind closed doors, who sabotage, threaten, bribe, betray. The ones who wear smiles on their faces and knives in their hands." He felt the crowd lean in, breathless. "I faced threats," he said. "Lost friends, lost deals, had doors slammed in my face, all because I refused to let hate slip by unnoticed." He stopped at center stage, grounding himself. "And I'm here to tell you, it was worth it." A slow ripple of applause started somewhere in the back, hesitant, unsure. It grew, gathering force, until the entire stadium was clapping, rising to their feet. Shaq didn't smile yet. He wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket again and pulled out the manila folder Mrs. Grant had given him. Yellowed clippings, faded photographs, evidence of a history the country liked to forget. "This isn't new," he said. "This is old. This is a cycle. Every time someone speaks up, the machine tries to crush them. But we don't have to accept it. We don't have to keep pretending that progress means ignoring the pain we see." He spread the clippings on the podium like a pastor laying out sacred texts. "This," he said, voice rising, "isn't about me. It's about every kid who's ever been told they're too much. Every neighbor who's been told to stay quiet. Every dreamer who's been told to shrink so someone else can feel bigger." The stadium vibrated with energy now, the crowd fully his. "I didn't come here to make you comfortable," Shaq said, fire in his chest. "I came here to wake you up." The MC shifted uncomfortably off stage, headset buzzing urgently in his ear. Producers waved frantic hands, signaling to wrap it up. Shaq ignored them. "I'm not asking you to cheer for me," he said. "I'm asking you to stand with the truth, even when it's messy, even when it's ugly, even when it costs you something." He stepped back from the microphone, letting the final words linger in the heavy, crackling air. The crowd surged to its feet again, not with the polite applause they had started with, but with a roar, raw, real, unstoppable. Shaq walked off stage without waiting for thanks, without basking in the moment. This wasn't about celebration. It was about reclamation. Backstage, chaos erupted. Producers barked into headsets. Sponsors fumed. Corporate executives wrung their hands, calculating damage control strategies. But amidst the confusion, Calvin, Mrs. Grant, and Grizz met him with grim, proud smiles. "You flipped it," Calvin said, awe in his voice. "Now they can't pretend anymore," Mrs. Grant added. Shaq simply nodded, feeling the weight lift off his shoulders, replaced by something lighter, sharper. Hope. Not blind hope. Not naive hope. Earned hope. Earned by standing when it would have been easier to sit. By speaking when it would have been easier to stay silent. By fighting, not with fists, but with truth. As the sun dipped low behind the stadium, painting the sky in molten gold, Shaq knew the battle wasn't over. The network still thrived. The machine still ground on. The whispers would continue. But he had cracked it. And through that crack, light was already pouring in. He pulled out the little girl's crayon drawing, still tucked safely in his jacket pocket, and smiled. A giant in a bright, smiling world. Maybe, just maybe, she had seen the future before he did. Maybe that future was already here. And Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq, was ready to build it, one unshakable truth at a time. Not because he was famous, not because he was perfect, but because he had refused to sit down, because he had kept standing, even when it would have been easier, safer, smarter to quit. He thought of Lucille, of the little girl's crayon drawing, of Calvin, Mrs. Grant, Grizz, of every person who had stood when it was hard. He smiled deep and real, not the smile the cameras demanded, the smile of a man who had fought the fight, taken the bruises, and kept walking forward. The man who didn't break. After the rally, the work continued. Slower, messier, sometimes frustrating, always necessary. Laws changed in some cities. School curriculums were rewritten. Police departments held uncomfortable but honest community meetings. Donations poured into organizations that had been scraping by for decades. And through it all, Shaq remained exactly who he was. Big-hearted, stubborn, unshakable. He didn't seek credit. He didn't cash in. He just kept showing up. One night, sitting alone on his porch, Shaq strummed an old guitar. Someone had gifted him. A cheap thing. A little out of tune, but still capable of making music. His fingers were too big for the delicate work, but he didn't mind. He wasn't trying to be perfect. He was trying to be true. And somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard 1,000 broken strings coming together. A symphony of stubborn hope, of stories too strong to silence. Shaq smiled into the night, his chest full. The world had tried to break him, but all it had done was teach him how to sing louder. Stand for the voices too often drowned out. Carry the truth forward, even when it's uncomfortable. Let courage, not comfort, define your legacy. Every story you amplify, every injustice you refuse to ignore. That's how real change begins. The fight doesn't end here. It starts with what you choose to do next.